Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Kayla Edwards from the Pulitzer Center. Thank you for joining us today for The Lasting Effects of Agent Orange on Laos. As we wait for more people to join us, please let us know in the chat where you're listening from. For those who have not joined us before, welcome. The Pulitzer Center is a nonprofit journalism and education organization with the mission to elevate public engagement with underreported issues. While we're based in Washington, D.C., our work and our staff are global. We support more than 170 reporting projects each year in collaboration with news outlets around the world, bringing together this work by themes on our website, including racial justice, migration, public health, and more. And we don't stop with the reporting. Our education programming spans elementary schools to graduate degree programs and outreach to the broader public. During our time today, we'll dive into the Pulitzer Center supported project, Agent Orange in Laos. In reporting published by the New York Times Magazine, today's speaker, George Black, writes, "The use of the herbicide in the neutral nation of Laos by the United States, secretly, illegally, and in large amounts, remains one of the last untold stories of the American war in Southeast Asia." Today's panelists will share insights on how this reporting project was completed, the work that individuals have done to document the effects of Agent Orange in Laos, and the work yet to be done in the country. Now, a few logistics as we begin. Our aim is to incorporate audience questions as part of today's conversation. You'll see a Q&A icon on your screen. Please begin adding your questions as soon as something comes to mind during the conversation. There's also a chat icon on your screen. We'd appreciate it if you'd use the chat box only for specific technology issues. Note that all attendees are muted, but if you can't hear us, let us know via the chat box. We also want to let you know that we are recording the session to post online at a later date. And one final note, please stay online once the conversation ends to participate in a brief survey. We'd love to know how we can improve our programming. Now, I'd like to briefly introduce today's speakers. George Black is a New York City-based writer specializing in international affairs and the environment. Black is the author of 7 books on a wide range of topics, including US policy in Latin America and the democracy movement in China. He's also the Pulitzer Center grantee behind the project Agent Orange in Laos. Susan Hammond is the founder of the War Legacies Project. Hammond holds a master's in international education from New York University and previously worked as a deputy director for the Fund for Reconciliation and Development. Thank you both for joining me here today. And I really want to start with just a kind of general background for our audience. George, in your piece for the New York Times Magazine, you write that the use of Agent Orange in Laos remains one of the last untold stories of the American war in Southeast Asia. Can you share with us how you came to cover the story of Agent Orange in Laos? Oh, and you're muted, George. Oh, okay. There you go.
I want to start with actually a more than the usual pro forma thanks to the Pulitzer Center. This is the second time they've supported my work. They supported a story I did a few years ago for the New Yorker magazine, and I just regard them as, indispensable. It's a tough time for international reporting. It has been for years, and without Pulitzer, I think a lot of these stories would just never get done. News organizations, even the big ones, just don't have the budgets anymore. The foreign bureaus don't exist. So thank you to Pulitzer. I started work on a book about the legacies of the war in Vietnam probably about 4 years ago. And it's about 4 legacies and how they're intertwined. One is the use of defoliants, including Agent Orange, and the long-term problems they've presented both for American veterans and for Vietnamese who were in areas that were sprayed massively. The second is the huge amount of unexploded ordnance bombs that remain in both Vietnam and Laos. They continue to cause large numbers of casualties every year, particularly from cluster bombs, which are small baseball-sized bombs that are very unstable and totally indiscriminate in their effects. The third aspect is those who were missing in action in Southeast Asia. And the fourth is the incidence of post-traumatic stress disorder among American veterans, particularly Marines who served there. So in the course of that, I knew about Susan Hammond's work, because what I tried to focus on is a small number of organizations and individuals who have tried to establish a kind of level playing field for how the legacies of the war for Vietnamese and Southeast Asians are dealt with. It took many, many years for American veterans to get recognition of their problems after the war, including disease that was associated with Agent Orange exposure and their PTSD. It took much, much, much longer for Vietnamese to get any kind of recognition at all. And I had known of Susan's work as one of a handful of people who'd really leveraged their skills and their interests into leveling the playing field, as I say. The first time I met Susan in person, having known of her work, was at a conference we both went to in Washington about 2 years ago at the US Institute for Peace. And quite a lot of people were there who had been intimately involved, particularly in the Agent Orange issue on both sides, US and Vietnamese. And we got into conversation with a man called Tim Reeser, who Susan had known for a long time, who is he's the Senate staffer on the Foreign Appropriations Subcommittee. And he is, I think, the longest serving Senate aide in Washington and chief aide to Senator Patrick Leahy of Vermont. And Leahy has been the force since the late 1980s, beginning in Vietnam and going on to something like 4 dozen countries emerging from war in getting humanitarian aid to Southeast Asia and many other countries. And Tim Reeser is the man who makes it happen. So we were in conversation with Tim talking about Vietnam, and Susan said to him, well, what about Laos? And he said, we don't have any aid in Laos because we don't know what happened there. So that was really the origin of the story.
And Susan, you're one of the characters readers are introduced to in this story. And so can we take a step back and outline for the audience, what the work that the War Legacies Project does and how you decided to start the organization?
Sure. And I also want to echo George's comments about the Pulitzer Center. And this is actually the second time we've had a reporter who's focused on some work in Vietnam on the Agent Orange issue. Christy Schwagen did a story many years ago on the green fence in Alui Valley. And she received support from Pulitzer for that. And so I want to thank you all for your support over the years to get these stories told, which is very difficult, as George said, to fund. But yeah, I started War Legacies Project. Well, I have a real long history, actually. I first went to Vietnam in 1991, just as a tourist. I'm the daughter of a veteran, so I was very interested in seeing what Vietnam was all about. Why is my first memory of my father was when I was 5, when he came home from his first tour of Vietnam, and just not quite grasping as a child, seeing the war on television, what was so important. So when I had the chance in 1991 to go, I visited for about 2 months to Vietnam and Cambodia at that time. And like many people who visit, it really, it took a hold of me, the country. And I knew I wanted to go back after my graduate degree was finished at NYU. And so I got involved first with the reconciliation process. As you remember, the US had a trade embargo and diplomatic embargo against Vietnam for 20 years after the war. And so I went to Vietnam for a second time, just as all that was lifting. And as the relationship strengthened on the diplomatic side and the economic side, the business side, war legacy issues started to come to the surface. The Vietnamese friends that I had and colleagues I was working with another organization, that the Fund for Reconciliation and Development, said, okay, now it's time to address these war legacy issues. So the unexploded ordnance and of course, Agent Orange. And I got very involved with the Agent Orange issue with some of the scientists in Vietnam who had did research there, the doctors who had been working with people who had disabilities that they believed were associated with Agent Orange. And I got very involved in trying to get the US government to acknowledge that Agent Orange was still a problem in Vietnam. That was a long process through the late 90s and early 2000s. And as that relationship developed, thanks again to Patrick Leahy, who really got involved and started putting funding into getting the US involved in the region, Laos had always been there for me. So I wanted to then begin to focus on Laos. But in how I started WLP, War Legacies Project, was just a lot of factors coming together. My boss at the time at the Fund for Reconciliation and Development, his focus was on the reconciliation part of the story, not necessarily the war legacy side. That's what I was focusing on. His interest would move to Cuba. My landlord in New York was selling our apartment. My roommate was moving to Jordan for another job. And I said, it's time to go out on my own. And I founded War Legacies Project and moved home to Vermont.
Thank you, Susan. And I would like to dive a little deeper into the actual history of how Agent Orange was used in Laos. And George, you wrote in your piece that the initial spraying of Laos was a mapping exercise. So can you explain basically how and why Agent Orange was used in Laos?
Yeah, for sure. I'm glad that Susan mentioned Christy Anschwanden's piece that the Pulitzer Center funded in this valley, the Aloe Valley, because that is actually, these two pieces are completely connected by geography. The thesis of my book really is that the worst legacies of the war were the result of how and where it was most strategically conducted by both sides. And that turned out in my research to be really a very, very small area. An area that collectively is the size of the state of Connecticut, maybe not even. And it's the two provinces of the former South Vietnam that were immediately below the demilitarized zone between North and South, and then the adjacent area of Laos along the border. And the reason for the strategic importance was that this was where the North Vietnamese forces came around the demilitarized zone and infiltrated the South. And they came along what became known as the Ho Chi Minh Trail. It was an incredible network of about 10,000 miles. People think of the Ho Chi Minh Trail as interstate highway that goes down, through Laos into Vietnam. It was a labyrinth of truck roads, mud roads, pathways, river crossings. I mean, everything you can imagine to get supplies funneled into the South. And the point where it entered South Vietnam was just south of the demilitarized zone, and it went into two places. One, which became famous in the history of the war, was near the Marine base of Khe Sanh, which was subjected to a siege during the famous 1968 Tet Offensive for 11 weeks. Americans came to know about that. But if you were an American soldier, as opposed to somebody watching the news at home, the place you really, really dreaded more than anywhere else in South Vietnam was this Aloe Valley, which is very close to Khe Sanh. And it's a unique place. It's very long, very narrow, and it's right up on the Lao border with very high mountains. And the Ho Chi Minh Trail came snaking in through the mountains, initially just by pathways that were used by porters or by elephants carrying supplies, and then in time became a network of roads that trucks could get through. And the dilemma was that the Americans knew that cutting the Ho Chi Minh Trail, stopping the supply line, was the key to winning the war, but they didn't know where it was, because this is remote, inhospitable country. It's high mountains, it's dense rainforest. It's very, very difficult to transit, even to this day, parts of it. And so they had to figure out where the trail was. So unlike in South Vietnam, where they used defoliants to expose base areas where they knew the Viet Cong, so-called, the communist Vietnamese, South Vietnamese, and the North Vietnamese were sheltering, they were exposing areas in order to attack places they knew the enemy was. And they also used it to defoliate, to destroy crop fields. And the crop destruction in many ways, to me, and I think Susan might probably agree, in terms of whether what was done through the chemical campaign was a war crime, I think the deliberate destruction of food crops, especially rice, comes to me much closer to the definition of a war crime than defoliation. Nonetheless, going back to Laos, where they did both over time, the problem is, where was the trail? Now, if people know anything about the war in Laos, and it remains pretty much unknown, apart from one thing, which is it was very, very massively bombed. And to the degree there has been international attention since the war, it's to the problem of unexploded ordnance, which is massive. But the bombers had to find their targets. And that's the principal reason the Ho Chi Minh Trail in Laos was sprayed. It was mapping, it was finding where the trail was, hidden under the trees. And so they dumped huge quantities of chemicals and finally exposed one target after another, mainly where the trucks were, where the logistical centers were, and they subjected it to this massive bombing campaign.
And what we know from your reporting, George, is that there were impacts, that there was a long-term impact of that spraying. And so, Susan, I'm curious if you could tell us what the War Legacies Project's work in Laos has looked like and how it maybe has differed from the work in Vietnam.
Yeah, the difference, there's a lot of differences, first of all, between the war in Vietnam and the war in Laos, as George was saying. But that in Vietnam, the Vietnamese had really been focusing on the impacts on the both the environment and the human impacts of Agent Orange since the war. They had scientists going down even during the war to look at the environmental impacts, and they had other doctors who were seeing these birth defects from people who served in the South who came home. Because women also from the South, from the North, went south during the war, and they were having children with birth defects. So it was very much on the minds of the people in Vietnam at the government level and the population as well. But in Laos, the spraying was in this very remote area, the very southern part of the country, and for the most part, the Lao government wasn't even the current Lao government, the government in the last 20 or so years, was uncertain where the spraying took place until the US government released and provided them both the bombing records in about 2000, and when they released the bombing records, they also released the spray records, so that we knew of the documented spraying in Laos in the South that was done by the ranch hand US Air Force pilots. We could see where the spray lines were. And so when we were trying to figure out, well, we don't know actually who's living in these areas, it's very remote. Some of the villages that we were working in 5 years ago, you could not get to them. The roads were not there, or you could, if there were roads, they were very muddy, difficult. You needed a 4-wheel drive, you needed to know how to drive on these rutty roads and across rivers, and very difficult to get to. So we knew the only way we were really going to find out is if we went village to village to village and surveyed to see, are we seeing the same type of health effects in Laos that you see across in Vietnam, where the Vietnamese had conducted surveys. They have, the Vietnam Association of Victims of Agent Orange keeps a list of people who have birth defects or illnesses that they believe are associated with the herbicides, as does the Red Cross in Vietnam. But there was none of that in Laos. So we received funding at first from a Swiss organization called Green Cross Switzerland, that enabled us to do this survey village to village at the villages that were underneath the spray run. So we looked at all of the villages in, well, not all of the villages, but the villages in 5 districts in Salavan and Savannakhet province that were within 5 kilometers of the spraying. And we just used the list. There was 2 lists we sort of focused on. One was the list that the Vietnamese have of birth defects that they believe are associated to exposure to Agent Orange. And the other is a list that the US Veterans Administration has for female veterans who served in Vietnam. And that list of birth defects is not associated to Agent Orange specifically, but to female service in Vietnam. But that was our guideline of, what types of potential birth defects we would be looking for. And we didn't know what we'd find. I mean, we were kind of hoping we would find no problems, because to provide services to people with severe disabilities in this very remote area is challenging. And so we are hoping to find no health problems. But sadly, we did find an average of 4 people born. And when I'm talking about people born with birth defects, we're obviously focusing on those who would have been born after the spraying started. But what we found is 2/3 were under the age of 20. So we're very young people who are still having these birth defects that are associated. We can go into the debate on the science, at another time, but are associated to potential exposure to dioxin, which is the problem from Agent Orange.
Thank you, Susan. And one of the core kind of parts of this story is having that access to data on the human impact. So I'm curious, George, how did Susan's work with the War Legacies Project kind of inform what happened, what you were able to produce in this story? And what were the challenges in you being able to kind of document some of that human impact in the story itself?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, I would say that in many respects, this is it's kind of an unusual story, and probably it would have been a difficult one to report, particularly if you didn't have some understanding of the background, the wartime background, which by that time, when we started talking about it 2 years ago, I did have a pretty good grasp of how the war was conducted and why this area was so important. And I knew of the work that this Canadian group of scientists, Hatfield Consultants, with whom the War Legacies Project has worked closely. I knew what they had done in Vietnam. I'd known one of their scientists probably for about 6 years now, and we talked about it. So I had the background to understand, these were not 2 separate wars. This was one war. The military command on both sides knew that this was an integrated battlefield. The border was meaningless. The ethnic minority groups who live there regard the border as meaningless. The border is a line drawn on a map by people with motives these local people don't understand. Many years ago, it shifts, it changes. The French drew a line. It's a meaningless border. So I had the military background, I think, pretty clearly. The second thing was that the military records that Susan refers to, the flight records, Hatfield Consultants, the Canadians, created maps from this, which she and her colleagues, Jackie and Nikovon, used to identify the villages they wanted to look at. And it allowed me to see the sort of military logic, but they weren't everything. I knew from talking to the Hatfield people and another scientist, Gene Stellman, who has done a lot of work on this, that many of the records were missing. There were rumors verging on clear understandings that the CIA, in addition to the Air Force, had been involved in spraying in Laos. And both Susan and I, pursuing our own trains of research, found other documents, other secret reports now declassified, which showed that the events added up by Hatfield were not the whole story. There was more. And in fact, we still, after finishing the reporting, still continue to find more. I found a document just last week that proves actually there was spraying a full year before what we were able to prove in the story, which is kind of an extraordinary revelation. It was a CIA document. So, it's layers of the onion. You keep unfolding, and there are millions of declassified documents now publicly available on the war in Southeast Asia. So, we'll never get to the bottom of the whole story. So that was the second part. The third part, I think there are particular, when you work for a magazine like the New York Times Magazine or the New Yorker, the fact checking is absolutely rigorous. I mean, it's kind of terrifying, the degree to which they put you through the grinder on fact checking. So you know that everything in the story has to hold water and be completely authenticatable. Authenticatable, if that's a word, authenticable, reliable. So there were two particular problems. You know, I started off obviously very interested in the work that the War Legacies Project was doing, admiring it, understanding its importance, but you can't just take it on face value because they're good people. You have to be able to know that their documentation is correct, that when they're making preliminary medical judgments, they're based on sound understanding and facts. So that was one thing. The second thing, which is trickier in a way, as I say, the people who were affected by this were small ethnic minority groups living along the border, quite a number of them, all speaking different languages. Few of them to this day, apart from the younger people, speaking Lao, the national language. So you've got to deal with interviews with people who, if they're old enough to remember the war and have eyewitness memories, they're going to be at least in their 60s, often 70s and 80s. So you're going through two translators from Taoi or Paco to Lao to English, and you're dealing with memories that may be suspect. I mean, can I remember what I was doing 20 years ago in detail? But you know, these were traumatic memories. And there were times where you could see that there was embroidery going on or people were fuzzy about the details. It's also just very hard to know how old people are when they tell you. At least two men told me they were 100 years old. Another one told me you were 110. I asked one old woman, she said, I'm 50. And I said, how long have you lived in this village? And she said, 60 years. All those things mean is I'm very old. So from all these interviews with elders, I had to pick and choose a few testimonies that were clearly reliable, vivid. In one case at our site, we met a man in one village that had been in a sprayed area. He had 10 children. 7 of them had either died or had birth defects. And he said, oh, I remember the spraying clearly because I was 14 years old. It was 1966, and it was the year I got married. And he was 66. He had a very, very sharp memory, 57 maybe. 57 years, I'm sorry, since, what am I getting mixed up with my dates here? He was 66 or 67, so he remembered it as a 14-year-old. And he said, yeah, there were probably about 10 flights that passed over this mountain, which he showed us near the town. Well, you go back to the records, and the official Air Force records show 2 flights in that area. So there's several others like that. Somebody would give a testimony and say, oh, yes, I saw that too, I was there. So complicated reporting, a lot of dimensions to the reporting, but in the end, you know, every single fact in the story passed muster with the fact checkers, and we knew that was essential if the outcome that I think we all wanted, which was to present a persuasive case to Patrick Leahy's office, that this had really happened. It had to be watertight, and I think in the end the story is.
And so I know there might be some journalists, and I see potentially also student journalists on listening in today. So I do want to dive a little bit deeper into that reporting process that you're mentioning, George, including how did you use military records and documents to tell this story? Can you give some insight for journalists who might be interested in doing similar work? Like, what were the nuts and bolts in terms of incorporating those into the story?
Sure. Do you want to go into that now or see if any of the journalists on the call want to pursue? Should I talk a little bit about it in general?
Yeah, let's talk a little in general and we'll see. And I will encourage anyone to go ahead and use the Q&A icon to submit questions to the journalists.
Yeah. One dilemma about the reporting period, particularly in the weeks just leading up to publication, this story was supposed to come out in 2019, and then COVID. And COVID meant that a lot of magazine stories were killed, a lot were postponed, and this one, there was more that I would have wanted to do, but was impossible because of COVID. And one thing was to go to the National Archives. Now, Susan can talk about that, because one of the 3 main sources of declassified material is what's in the National Archives, and it's a massive amount. Fortunately, although you can't research much of the National Archives online, you have to go in person, there is a vast repository of information in the collection at Texas Tech University. And I mean, it literally millions of documents from the war. And once you get used to how to do specific research online, where you have, what they have is a very, very good keyword search capacity, where you can search within a document, within a term. You start finding things like pilots' names, and you start finding records of people's recollections of secret missions. There's all sorts of stuff in there. The CIA has a much more limited amount of archival material declassified. There is a CIA facility called CREST, C-R-E-S-T, which gives a certain amount. It's not as easy to search as the Texas Tech collection, but it gives you some hints, like the document I found just last week about the 1964 defoliation. Do you want to say something about the National Archives, Susan? Because you spend a load of time there that I haven't.
Yeah, I mean, I've been trying to get back there through COVID as well, and it's been closed to research, but it's incredibly, I mean, football fields really of boxes of these original documents, primary source documents. And so it's a challenge to, again, get drilled down to exactly what you're looking for. Like, you might need to know an exact unit number who may have been in that region of the country. I mean, whether you're looking at Vietnam, Laos, or Cambodia, you need to know the unit who may have been there. And it's really challenging when you're looking at issues in Laos or Cambodia, where we don't know if the records are just classified, if they weren't keeping records because they were secret missions, whether, you know, it's kind of a needle in a haystack in some ways, because, but as George says, once you find one document, it can lead to another and lead to another. So it's and you can get dug down into these rabbit holes of going in the wrong direction of very interesting information, but just not stuff that you really are focused on. I mean, we are right now working on a FOIA request to try to get information released, whether it's from the archives or the CIA documents. There's also things that might be at the Nixon Library or the Johnson Library. So there's many archives throughout the country that you really need to spend a lot of time digging through to even get you a lead into what you're really looking for.
I would even add two more. I mean, the JFK archive, some of which is accessible, some of which you'll find documents cited in histories of the period. Some of the most critical decisions about Laos and the Aloe Valley were actually taken during the Kennedy administration, including the decision to start crop destruction, which was something the South Vietnamese government wanted very badly, and something that Kennedy himself had huge misgivings about and didn't want to authorize. And the military commander at the time, General Harkins, we're talking now about the end of 1962, he said, yeah, well, won't do it, Mr. President, without sufficient psychological operations to prepare the local population. The idea being, you know, Kennedy was saying, well, if you destroy people's crops, how do you know they're enemy crops? How do you know they're not just regular villagers? And this was a war where the problem with the war is no one knew who the enemy was, because anyone could be the enemy, which is why so much of the violence was indiscriminate. And the first place that was authorized for the use of crop destruction was the Aloe Valley. And I tell the story briefly in the story in the New York Times Magazine, that the person who supervised the first spraying was now General Colin Powell, who was an Army major at the time, attached to a special forces base. There's also one other source, and this goes to the question of how truthful the record keeping and the accounting of the ranch hand defoliation has been by the military itself. There is a repository of documents at the US Department of Agriculture that is the collection of a man called Alvin Young, who was the Air Force colonel, who was their chief toxicologist and wrote a very detailed technical history of the various so-called rainbow chemicals that were used in Southeast Asia. And it's important to say that the agent that killed most of the crops was not Agent Orange. It was an arsenic-based compound called Agent Blue, which was a carcinogen, is believed to be associated with birth defects. It's never really been studied. It's another of the legacies of the war that has never really been investigated. But I found a document in Alvin Young's archive just quite recently. One of the arguments they made is, oh, US servicemen could never have been exposed because they always made a point of overflying the target area first in a spotter plane and making sure that no American soldiers were in the vicinity. So I found a document which was a map that Alvin Young had of, coincidentally, 4 spray missions right over a base where a friend of mine, a Marine who is in the book, was stationed at the time. And these flights are passing within half a kilometer of his fixed positions. So there were a lot of things covered up and lied about, frankly.
We are getting a lot of very good questions in the Q&A, so I'm keeping a check of the time to make sure we get through a lot of them. But I do want to also ask you, George, so in a lot of ways, you are working side by side with Susan, drawing on some of the work of the War Legacies Project in order to report this story. But it's clear that Susan is an advocate in this work. And I know you've talked about or are thinking about over the course of this story, what your role as a journalist is. If you could speak to some of the thoughts that you had as you were reporting the story on that line of how you approach the work.
Yeah, it's sort of what I said before about everything having to pass muster with the most thorough fact-checking. I've never really believed in the concept of objectivity in journalism. I do believe in the concept of accuracy. But I think the truth of the matter is, you know, if you look, let's take an obvious current example. Why are so many journalists focused on what happened on January 6th? It's because they found it appalling. You know, I mean, the motivation is quite clear, and often you have to conceal your motivation, but that's why you're doing it, is you want to get to the bottom of something that was awful, that one of the 2 major political parties is trying to say wasn't that awful and didn't really happen. You know, you have a motivation to do certain stories. Why would anyone want to take on this forgotten story of Laos except hoping that there would be an outcome, and it was the outcome that your main characters had been working towards, and that was to get an American aid program. Now, I make no secret of the fact that I am deeply sympathetic to that. I am thrilled at the idea that the reporting, you know, with the influence of the New York Times behind it might help to make that happen. Is that objectivity? No. Is it accuracy and I think responsible reporting with the help of, you know, the magazine adhering to those values? Absolutely.
Thank you, George. And to that point, when you mentioned the possibility of an aid program from the US, Susan, I'm curious if you could tell us a little bit about the challenges on both the side of the US government and the Lao government of actually acknowledging what has happened in Laos.
Yeah, it has been challenging. And I mean, the biggest challenge was just that information gap that we were trying to fill with our survey. But even once we had that information, we had challenges on both the Lao side, who was looking for proof, and which is a very hard thing to come by, in that we can't prove that any of those people we've identified with these birth defects, that their birth defects are caused by the herbicides. We are now in the process of doing a comparative study as soon as we can get back to Laos, of looking at villages that weren't sprayed, that have the same ethnic populations, the same traditions, the same types of food sources, and faced with the same, you know, they were also faced with the war, the bombing part of the war, but they weren't impacted by the spraying, and comparing that to the villages that were underneath the spraying to see if there is that difference. But we did find that when we looked at the individual villages, that those that were closest to the spraying tended to have much higher rates of people with these birth defects in them. But we need to do more research. But for the Lao, I mean, the Vietnamese, the proof for them was that it was sprayed and that they have these people with birth defects. And then since 2007, the US government has been funding programs in Vietnam, to provide support to people in the formerly sprayed regions of Vietnam, for people with disabilities. And right across, I mean, if they were a person who was born just 2 kilometers away in this border that George talks about that was very fluid, they wouldn't qualify for that. And so our point when we were talking to Senator Leahy's office was, you can't treat the two differently. It was the same war, the same chemicals. We see you're helping those on this side of this imaginary line who have these birth defects, but you're not helping those on the other side. And once we came up with those numbers, we did get the support from Senator Leahy's office. There's a whole process going forward of, will it get into this next appropriations bill, some funding to provide both support for people in the sprayed areas of Laos, but also to explore some of the issues of, is there still dioxin contamination in this in the areas that were sprayed? Is there dioxin contamination from the herbicides around the bases where the US had a heavy presence in Laos during the war? And there's many, probably a half a dozen or so that could possibly have had barrels of herbicides stored, but we don't know because those records are not classified. But we are making progress on this effort to get the US engaged, and the Lao government now have asked the US to help them understand more about the use of Agent Orange in Laos. And that's been a big step to get them to, I mean, they've been so focused, rightly so in so many ways, on the unexploded ordnance that has dropped. I mean, Laos is the most bombed country per capita in the world, and they have a huge issue of dealing with cleaning up the unexploded ordnance. For this issue of Agent Orange that they didn't know so much about, it wasn't secondary, it's just that they just felt they had enough information yet. And that fact checking in the New York Times really made a difference. It wasn't just me saying, you have a problem here, you need to ask the US for help. It was documented and fact checked by a reputable a news source. And that made a huge difference in moving this forward.
Okay, so now I do want to turn to some audience questions, and we'll try to get through as many as we can. So one is from audience member Leilani. She gives a bit of context, so I'm actually going to read out the full question. And she writes, I'm indigenous to Guam, where 75% of all BE-52s used in Southeast Asia were based. Service members say they used Agent Orange across Guam in 1962 to 1975 with no input from the indigenous population, as Guam was still under US martial law until 1970. Still, neither veterans who served in Guam during the Vietnam War nor civilians like myself are recognized as being exposed to herbicide. How can journalists and community members tell a more complete story about the footprint and legacy of our Agent Orange use that includes rapid militarization of Asia, the Pacific after World War II? So that's from Leilani. It's about how we can include potentially other places, including Guam, in this story.
Susan?
Okay. Yeah, Guam is one of the many unanswered questions, or thoroughly answered questions about this big story of the use of Agent Orange throughout the South, the war in Southeast Asia. Okinawa is another one of those unanswered questions. And I have a personal interest in the Okinawa part because I spent 2 years there when I was a child, when my father was stationed there. But there has been some research that's started, but testing of soils in some places, if I remember correctly, definitely in Okinawa, and I believe also in Guam. But it's that digging through all the archives and trying to get this information released, because the US military swears they did not have any barrels on Guam, but then there are records of ships that had Agent Orange on them that docked in Guam. So it's digging through a lot of information. I think it's another part of the untold story of Agent Orange that even 50 years, 60 years later, we're still finding out more information. So I would love, George, take it on as your next challenge.
I would add one thing to that, which is Korea.
Mm.
The demilitarized zone in Korea was heavily defoliated. And in addition to that, the principal American ally in the war in Southeast Asia was the Republic of Korea, South Korea. And there have been Agent Orange lawsuits and veterans grievances in Korea about their exposure. So this is a very, and not to mention all the places where the herbicides were tested, like Susan's birthplace of Camp Drum, now Fort Drum, upstate New York, several military bases, Eglin Air Force Base in Florida. And, you know, part of the complexity of this story is I think there is very little evidence that the military and civilians in government knew at the time. I think this is really important to say because there is one fragmentary account many years later from someone who had served with the chemical corps that they had known of the health problems associated with the dioxin in Agent Orange during the war. Never corroborated. There is evidence certainly that the chemical companies who produced it convened secret meetings of their executives in the early 60s, in the early days of the campaign, because they realized that it created a very chronic skin condition in workers at their plant called chloracne. Where am I going with this thought? Sorry, I lost my thread there. What the chloracne, the chemical manufacturers? Yeah, I think in general though, you know, when you go back to the early testing, which took place in many, many places, I think, you know, one scientist who works a lot on the issue and is a specialist, she said, you know, the ingredient that we worry about now, people would have sprinkled it on their breakfast cereal. It was, you know, a standard ingredient in what you were putting on lawns and golf courses and farm fields in the United States for years. But the issue is the concentrations that were used, because what was sprayed in the war was many, many orders of magnitude more concentrated. The excuse was always, don't worry about it, you know, it's what American farmers use. And frankly, you know, you have to worry about the long-term health of American farmers who are using this stuff. They may not have been exposed in the same quantities per application, but if they were doing it year in, year out, who knows what health problems they suffered as a consequence. It's a huge story. I mean, the full story of Agent Orange and dioxin probably will never be told or fully understood.
Just one more addition to that is there is a writer named John Mitchell who, if I remember, he's from the UK somewhere too. He might even be Scottish. I'm not sure. Maybe he's Welsh. But anyway, he has been working on digging up the story of Agent Orange in Okinawa. And I believe he started to look a bit into Guam. And he recently came out a book called Poisoning the Pacific. And there might be something in there about Guam, but I'm not 100% sure.
Thank you both. So we have another question from Francisco, who's a journalism student and wanted to know what the FOIA process was like for you, George.
I actually didn't do any FOIA work on this story. FOIA requests take an inordinate amount of time. There was such an overwhelming mass of material in what had already been declassified that I actually didn't pursue FOIA requests on this. Susan, as she said, is now actively considering FOIA requests on CIA secret spraying in Laos, but it means tailoring very, very precise questions. Otherwise, what you get is a bunch of newspaper clips from government agencies that are worthless.
Yeah, it's challenging, and you really have to sort through all the, like George said, all the released information. Otherwise, you just get what they've already released back and not what you're actually asking for. And so it's been a long process, but we have received support from my Senator Leahy's office, Senator Whitehouse office to say that, yes, this needs to be released. And all of the information, we're now 50 something years out. This information should be released, and so much of it is still classified, and you have to ask why at this point.
Someone else in the audience writes, the United Nations in 1995 created the role of independent expert dealing with the human rights impact of the use of toxic chemicals. And they're wondering if you engage with any of the mandate holders on your work, Susan.
No, not really. I've been mainly what we've been sort of working with our group, the Hatfield consultants that George mentioned. There's some of the work to identify where the persistent organic pollutants are in countries around the world. So there's been some funding that's come to organizations like Hatfield to document those POPs, and dioxin is one of those organic pollutants. So there's been some work that way in identifying where there could be problems from these pollutants, with dioxin from the Agent Orange. And so both in Vietnam and Laos, Cambodia, and other places, there's some efforts going on that, but I haven't been in any of the other UN related groups, though they have a very active environmental, or for a while, an environmental impacts of war effort going on. And interestingly, that now that the Vietnam government was the head of the Security Council for the past month or so, they've been raising this issue of Agent Orange at UN meetings.
Thank you. And then Emma from our audience asks, have either of you seen in your work any connection made between climate change and the legacies of war? And the example that they give, has extreme weather affected the search process for unexploded ordnances, or any connection that you've seen between the two?
For certain. I don't work directly on unexploded ordnance work. I'm more on the advocacy side of that, but my colleagues at MAG and Halo Trust and others, who I talked to, there was some severe flooding in this past year. There was 10 typhoons that went through the central coast of Vietnam and then went straight into Laos. Landslides, roads washed out, and areas that were formerly cleared from unexploded ordnance, they're finding they have to go back because that washed down. And part of the problem with the herbicides, the use of the destruction of the primary forest and the canopies below, left the soil very degraded. There's a lot of erosion at the time of the war, but what's grown in place are invasive grasses or shrubs that don't contain the soil very well. So when you get these massive storms that come through, you have just huge flooding that happens throughout, and it does have an impact on moving of these ordnance around. In fact, we have to drive through rivers a lot to get to villages. And I remember shortly after storm, when the river was cleared and we drove through, it wasn't until I passed through and my Lao, the Lao guide who was helping me get through this channel where you normally go, I realized, oh my goodness, there might have been, since we just had flooding, there might have been an unexploded ordnance in this river that we didn't know. It wasn't there 2 days ago, when the river was not, was flooded. I mean, before it was flooded. So yeah, it's a huge problem.
I'd add about Vietnam, I mean, two things. One is that the areas that were deforested are now massively replanted with acacia plantations. It grows very fast, it's very cheap, it gives farmers extra income, and most of it goes to IKEA and other furniture makers as wood chips. And those forests are almost entirely devoid of wildlife. This was incredibly rich, biodiverse area. The Alloy Valley, all those surrounding mountainous areas that were sprayed. And now, there's not an insect, there's not a bird, there's just long straight lines of acacia saplings. I'd also say, in relation to Vietnam, this is sort of how history works in a chain of cause and effect. Another area that was heavily sprayed was the mangrove forests of the southernmost part of South Vietnam. They were wiped out during the war, and land use has radically changed in that area. The mangrove swamps, which were a tremendous storm barrier against storm surges from tropical storms, those are gone. They're replaced by shrimp farms. And they're now the Mekong Delta and the southern peninsula of South Vietnam are listed among the top I think in some accounts, even the most threatened area in the world from sea level rise. Now, okay, it's not a direct consequence of Agent Orange, but Agent Orange had a real role in it.
And it looks like we have just enough time for maybe one last question. And so Amy in our audience just wants to know about the status of lawsuits or any possibility for compensation for victims. And so I think that's just a good way to round out our discussion today.
Yeah, that's a sad story, actually. The problem, there was a lawsuit recently filed by a French Vietnamese citizen named Tran Tho Nha, who sued the chemical companies in French court for her her illnesses and the death of her child and other birth defects in her family. And that case, just beginning of in May, was thrown out of court because, and what's happened with other veterans who've filed lawsuits since the first settlement in 1984, the Vietnamese who filed a lawsuit in 2004, all of the cases since that big settlement for the veterans case have been thrown out of court for not having standing because the chemical companies are considered government contractors. And since you cannot sue the US government, you cannot sue a government contractor of the US government. So they are immune from lawsuit. So that is the challenge. But just on an aside, on June 28th on PBS, there will be a film that covers part of Tran Tho Nha's lawsuit called The People versus Agent Orange. That'll be airing on PBS on June 28th. So if you're interested in that, but yeah, it's almost impossible at this point. People have not really looked at whether or not the Lao could sue both for Agent Orange and also the use of bombing in Laos, because it was an illegal, we were not supposed to be there. We were not supposed to be dropping chemicals and dropping bombs on Laos. It was supposed to be a neutral territory. I think that would still be a very, very challenging lawsuit, but.
Wow. The Pulitzer Center is so thankful to both of you, George Black and Susan Hammond, for today's conversation. And thank you to our audience. Also, I'd like to thank my colleagues at the Pulitzer Center, especially Naomi Andu, our producer for today's session. And we appreciate all of you for joining us today. For those who are able, please consider supporting our mission with any level of contribution. Remember, we're a nonprofit journalism organization, so we depend on donors to carry on our work. Thank you again, George and Susan. We'd also like to share information about an upcoming event shining a light on global mass incarceration, trauma ethics, and prison reporting. This conversation will be on June 30th at 11 a.m. Eastern Time, and you can register at pulitzercenter.org/events. I also ask that you please stay online for a few minutes longer to take a brief survey after we officially close today's session. Thank you, George and Susan, again for being with us here today, and we hope our audience will join us again soon. Goodbye for now.